Hello, I'm Rachel Rudolph, the Extension Vegetable Specialist at the University of Kentucky, and I'm going to discuss seeding and transplant production. To prepare for seeding, you need to get several items in place, including potting soil, seed, trays, a dibbler, which is the item in the photo with the yellow pegs, labels or tags, water, bench space, and potentially a heat mat, and I'll discuss that later. Firstly, use relatively new potting soil. Potting soil should not be more than a year old, as it can affect germination and transplant quality. Potting soil in the original package is usually pretty dry. For each seeding event, you want to remove enough potting soil for that particular seeding event and put it in a bin or a tub that's designated for prepping potting soil. This bin should not really be used for anything else, as you want it to be clean and free from residue. With experience, you will learn how much potting soil you need to fill a certain number of trays. Fill your bin with the needed potting soil, break up the dry clumps, and then add water little by little. The potting soil should be moist when it goes into the trays, but not dripping wet. Add a little water, mix it throughout the potting soil, add more water as needed. You're going to continue to mix the water with the potting soil and remove any clumps. If you make a fist with the potting soil in your hand and water drips or squeezes out, it is too wet. You can add more potting soil to take up the excess water. Once the potting soil is ready, you can fill your trays. Filling the trays is somewhat of an art. The goal is for each cell in the tray to contain the same amount of potting soil. You don't want the potting soil to be too compacted or too loose in each cell, as that will affect the root ball and the ultimate quality of the transplant. I like to lightly fill each cell, gently pushing the potting soil down, and then add more potting soil on top of that. Lightly dropping the tray from a height of a few inches can firm up the potting soil in each cell, and that can be helpful. You then want to smooth the top of your tray and brush any excess potting soil away. Transplant trays come in different sizes. Some of the most common are 50, 72, and 128 cell trays. The dimension of the trays stays the same, but the cells within those trays are either larger or smaller depending on the number of cells. There are corresponding dibblers for each tray size. The tray size you use is often determined by the plants you are going to grow. For example, small rooted plants like lettuce do better in trays with smaller cells, like 72 or 128. Larger rooted plants or fast growing plants often do better in larger cell trays like a 50 cell. Tomatoes and cucurbits are often grown in 50 cell trays. You may also choose to grow transplants in small cell trays like a 128, and then once they have outgrown that tray, you could pot up to a larger tray. If you start your transplants very early in the year and it's too cold to transplant out in the field, potting up can be a helpful strategy. Your transplants will stay healthy and will be larger when they finally go outside. Once you have filled your trays with potting soil, you can use the dibbler that matches your tray. Place the dibbler so the pegs line up with the center of each cell. Press down to make even holes in each cell. Remove the dibbler and now you're ready to seed. Seeding depth depends on the size of the seed. It's often determined visually rather than with an exact measurement. The rule of thumb is that the depth is approximately twice that of the size of the seed. For example, if a tomato seed is 3 millimeters in diameter, the seeding depth should be about 6 millimeters. This helps you not bury the seed too deep, which can negatively affect germination. You can seed with your hands or with a tool. If the seed is very small, A tool to help direct the seed into each hole can be helpful to avoid putting more than one seed per cell. Once you've seeded the entire tray with one seed per hole, go back and lightly fill in the holes to cover the seed. Then add a tag to each tray. Include the cultivar name, date of seeding, and if you're in a shared space, your name. The date of seeding is helpful to reference later to know if your transplants are growing well and on track. So you can say, oh, these transplants are 3 weeks old or 4 weeks old. This also helps you plan for prepping things out in the field if you know your transplants are 2 weeks away from being transplanted out. Another component to keep in mind is the quality of the seed you are using. There are many places to purchase seeds, especially online. Purchase seed from reputable sources only. Seed packets should have a lot number, a germination rate, and a date. The date on the seed packet helps you keep track of the age of your seed. Germination declines with time, so the older the seed, the worse the germination is likely to be. Storing your seed well keeps it in good condition for longer. You may not use all your seed in the same year it was purchased, so store your seed in a cool place protected from pests or rodents. We like to store our seed in plastic bags by crop and in a sealed plastic bin that is kept in a cooler. A vacuum seeder is a great option if you are going to be seeding many trays of the same cultivar. Not just the same crop, but the same cultivar with the same seed. A vacuum seeder is comprised of a dibbler, a tray, and a vacuum. The tray contains small holes, and each hole will hold one seed. You will fill your tray as you normally would, and then use the dibbler to make holes for the seed. Turn the vacuum on to create suction inside the tray. Spread the seed on the tray. The suction created by the vacuum will pull a seed into each hole in the tray. The excess seed can be funneled towards the channel on the edge of the tray. Once there is a seed over each hole in the tray, flip the tray over on top of your transplant tray and then release the suction by flipping the switch on the side. Make sure everything is lined up before you release the suction. Give the tray a few taps to make sure all the seed is released. Flip up the tray, double check your work, cover seed lightly with potting soil as you normally would, and repeat the process. Once you have all your trays seeded and labeled, you will need to water everything in. Depending on the time of year, you may need to water once or twice a day. In the cooler months, you may only water one time per day, but in the summer, we usually water once in the morning and once in the late afternoon. A heat mat is a helpful tool to consider to improve germination. Tomato, for example, germinates best between 75 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. You can program a heat mat to heat potting soil at any given temperature. There is a sensor that helps monitor the temperature of the potting soil, and that can be adjusted as time goes on. Keep in mind that if you're using a heat mat, you may need to water more frequently even in the winter because the potting soil can dry out. Depending on the time of year, transplants can take more or less time to be finished. For example, if we seed tomatoes in February, it may take 6 weeks for the plants to get to an appropriate transplant size. In July, though, tomatoes may only take 4 weeks before they are ready to be transplanted. You may be asking, how do I know when my transplants are ready? The vegetative part of the plant that you can see is an important gauge, but the root ball inside the cell is also an important component to consider. If the transplants can be easily removed from their cells, the roots are well formed, and the potting soil stays together when you remove a transplant from the cell, that is a good indication that they are ready to be transplanted. Once you think your transplants are ready, Ideally, you would harden them off outside in their tray to reduce transplant shock. If weather permits, you can put them on a bench outside for a couple of days, which will help strengthen them and acclimate them to the outside conditions before they are removed from their trays and transplanted into soil. A few things to keep in mind: purchase seed from reputable sources, store seed in a cool, safe place, free from pests and rodents, use new, fresh potting soil every year. Make more transplants than you think you need, just in case. Things can go wrong. If growing transplants in the colder months, consider using a heat mat and make sure to plan for longer amounts of time for transplant production. Resources include the Vegetable Crops Extension and Research website, UK ID 36 Vegetable Production Guide for Commercial Growers, and once you get ready to transplant, we have a video for that called Successful Transplanting. Funding is provided by the USDA Extension Implementation Program.